So last night I watched Trauma from 2017, courtesy of Wheelchair Way to Heaven, who commented on my disturbing iceberg video around 4 months ago, YouTube says. Commented about the film and said that Trauma from 2017 easily is the most messed up film that they had ever seen. He wrote that trauma earns its name within 5 minutes, and you'll be scarred for life if you make it halfway. So, according to this person, at least from their own personal experience, there's nothing that comes close to Trauma, and if anything does, he won't watch it. So that was the comment there, and I mean, if that's not an invitation, I don't know what is. So, I actually have, at this point, I have a list that I'm keeping of viewer requests for me to watch a film and review it, and this was one of them. I'm not going through that list particularly quickly, seeing as this is the first one, and technically it wasn't a request, but to me it kind of is. When you come into a comment section and you say, this is the most disturbing thing I've ever seen, and it wasn't one of the films I had already watched, I have to watch it eventually. So I do take viewer requests, but in my own time. You know, I watch movies when I'm in the mood for watching a movie, and I watch horror movies when I'm in the mood for horror, and I watch extreme and insane horror when I'm in the mood for that, which is, even less of the time. So, but when I do sit down for some of the extreme stuff, I also come into it with a certain respect, and I don't know. I guess ever since completing that iceberg challenge and making that video, I have a certain, I don't know if expectation is the right word, but I respect what a film can do to you. Anyway, so the IMDb description for this film is 4 friends partying in a house in the middle of nowhere are brutally attacked by a man and his son, forcing the remaining women to take vengeance upon them. And that description doesn't really say a whole lot. So what actually goes on is that you have 4 friends, all of them are women, and they visit a rural location in Chile. I think that country is pronounced Chile, right? And not Chile. Anyway, and yes, they are attacked by a man and his son, and they eventually kind of decide to confront these men with the help of a policeman. And through that confrontation, they discover that they're up against something that's pretty tough. So why does the commenter say that the film earns its name within the first 5 minutes? Trauma has an opening sequence. It starts out with one of those little pieces of text that says based on a true story or inspired by a true story, I think it actually says, which I think is mostly there for shock value because inspired can mean anything. I mean, is there a movie that exists that isn't inspired by something from our world? So, what does that really mean? I think it's there for shock value, but the opening sequence itself is pretty interesting. Basically, you have a woman strapped to a chair who has clearly already been tortured. She's bruised, there's a bunch of blood by her vagina, and then her son is brought into the room, and he is forcefully injected with something, which I'm assuming I think it's called an aphrodisiac, or it's like, I don't know if fluid Viagra exists, but if it does, that was probably what it was supposed to be. Because he's then forced to penetrate his mother's, and as he's forced to do it, and he's being like, the movement is being pushed by a soldier behind him that's making him do it, right? And as he is forced to keep doing it, his mom is then shot in the head in front of him, and then he is still forced to keep doing it, and then eventually the soldier is ordered to kind of let go and stop, and then he actually keeps doing it himself, which is a pretty insane opening sequence to a film, I will admit. We have not even gone 6-7 minutes into the film, and we already have off-screen and implied torture. Not on-screen torture, but implied. We have an injection with needle. We have, I guess you would call it forced incest. And combined with killing and necrophilia at the same time between a son and his mother. So, pretty insane start to a film. In case you're wondering what the actual story is there, it's the scene itself is apparently set in the era of Pinochet, I think, which was in the late 70s of Chile. And basically, the son in the scene who does the stuff is supposed to be the bad guy who does the stuff to the women later on in the film. So that's where the connection is supposed to be. Then we cut to more modern times, and pretty quickly we have nudity and I would even call it softcore porn between some women, which are the characters that you follow in the film. And then after some time, and this film does kind of drag at certain points, I will say, we get to a dual rape sequence where the man who is much younger in the opening sequence and is much older in the modern day sequences, him and his son are now raping the actual main characters of the film, which are the 4 girls. Well, they rape 2 of the 4. It's a scene where the son takes a literal bite out of one of the victim's cheek as he is sexually abusing her. And then he actually gets up and then grabs a handful of salt, I think it is, and pours it in the wound on the cheek, which is probably sounds a bit more brutal than it was. I don't know why, but for some reason this film just didn't really get under my skin, and I kind of wasn't buying it a lot of the time. This is also a sequence that a lot of people describe as being very long and drawn out and difficult. And to me, it really wasn't. To me, it was actually very quick. And at this point, there had already been some drama between the girls about who was hating who and who was disliking this, that, and the other person. You know, it was female drama. And I kind of hated the characters a little bit already. So I was almost like indifferent at this point when the abuse sequences actually started. And then later, you have a sequence where there's 4 people pointing a gun at the bad guy. So we have 4 guns. Somehow he magically kills 3 of them and then leaves. So this sequence is not torture, it's just violence. And at this point I'm like, the bad guy in this film is like the guy from Sisu, except he's not a superhuman being, but he survives through plot armor and violence instead. And another thing that bothers me is that there's also scenes where the girls just aren't doing anything. And they feel like they're passengers, even though they don't have to be. So physically, they are able to get up and do stuff, and they're just sitting there. And it kind of annoyed me, because one of the frustrating things about depictions of acutely dangerous situations and acutely traumatic situations is there are some films that take that approach where they think it's more realistic that the person is so shocked that they can't do anything. But the reality is that that's not how everyone reacts to situations like that. For some people, they do freeze up and they don't manage to do anything. That is true. But in reality, there's also a lot of people who are actually very good at taking action in the acute situation. Even though they are being traumatized, they still take that action, and then for a lot of people, they don't actually realize the effect that the situation had on them until after the fact. So it's really annoying when you're watching characters just being way too passive in a film like this. At least to me it is. Anyway, later we also have a police officer who gets gassed to death, which is pretty gory. We have a woman getting defenestrated, which she somehow survives and then is put in a contraption and then has her jaw ripped off and then dies, which again is pretty gory. We also have a woman at the very end who dies from something that I couldn't tell what was. Again, a lot of the stuff that happens in this film is actually off screen or is like done in a way that you can't really tell. So I don't know what killed her. I think it looked like some organs, or maybe her heart was like on the outside of her body when she was dead. I don't know what that means, to be honest. It wasn't very clear to me. And then finally, the film has a final standoff between kind of the main bitch and the bad guy, where she shoots a container of acid that falls down and melts in his face and melts his head and kills him slowly. So that was pretty cool. Pretty cool. Now, all of these sequences with all the violence, all the sexual abuse, and all the gore and the stuff is interspliced with flashback scenes of what the bad guy was forced to do and did willingly, but sometimes was also forced to do in his younger days. And forced by who, you may say? Well, by his father. Or if it wasn't his father, it was I think it may have actually been the officer who forced him to do the thing to his mom in the opening sequence and who shot and killed his mom. Whether it was his actual father or it was that officer. No, you know what? I'm pretty sure it was the officer. But he functions as a forceful father figure. But the stuff that he makes him do it's mostly regular violence, really. And then there is one sequence that sticks out where, how do I describe this? He dips his finger in what is obviously lubricant and then sexually penetrates, or at least to me it is implied that that's what he does, off screen, a baby, actually, which is pretty... It's a bit crazy, but it is off screen, so you can kind of grin and bear and get through it. Here's the thing. This film has kind of a lot of the ingredients for something that's more crazy, but the way that it executes it doesn't really hit for me. And I feel like I'm in an awkward situation now because there's this person who is clearly honestly expressing that it's the most disturbing thing they've ever seen in their life. And I don't want to be the edgy person who's like, this was kindergarten, what are you talking about, whatever. That's not what this is about, and that's not what I'm trying to turn this into, which makes it a bit tough for me because it really wasn't that hard for me to watch, if I'm being honest. I lost maybe a minute of sleep last night over this, but I didn't lose 5 minutes. The film is gratuitous. It's a pretty good, decent Chilean attempt at exploitation. It has lesbian softcore porn, it has rape, it has violence, it has a lot of things going for it. It's really, really tough to not compare this to a Serbian film, which is unfortunately superior in every way, in my opinion. The directing, the acting, the plot, the cinematography, it's all just better in a Serbian film. The writing itself is better. The characters make more sense. And for this one, I feel like it's really the themes of the film that are more kind of horrendous. I also have to admit, the movie drags, and it's an hour and 45 minutes long, which makes no sense. And a lot of the parts of the film that drags are actually not the painful parts, which means that for a film that is allegedly supposed to be as brutal as this one, there is, to me, a kind of weirdly distinct lack of on-screen torture. Like, I actually was mentally ready for a torture porn flick when I went into this, and that's somehow not what it is. I'm also having trouble with suspension of disbelief, because even though the practical effects of this film and the gory stuff is very well done, I'm just not really buying it for some reason. Like, there's just too many times in this film where someone could have died, but they didn't because it feels like it's the reason why is because the script says so. Like, it doesn't make sense. And the weirdest part is that I actually rooted for the bad guy a lot of the time in this film because at certain points, he's genuinely the most rational character, and the other people are just too frustrating to care about. So when you watch a film with this much depravity in it, and then you start rooting for the depraved person, it feels like there's something that kind of didn't work. And it's weird because when I actually look at the community reactions and the different reactions that people have to this film, it's completely different. Like, Some people find that the rape sequence was super long and all the crazy stuff was completely like way too much and it was just so brutal. And for me, I was like, no, actually all the crazy stuff could have been longer and more detailed. It could have been more detailed, it could have been more on screen, and we could have had more brutality, and we just didn't. So it's very clear to me that there are some very, very differing opinions on this film. And I think personally, I lean more toward the kind of harmless, the tamer sort of experience of it. And I'm not saying that this is a competition about who can handle what. I mean, there are people who think that I was a quivering pussy for disliking Martyrs or for getting wrecked by Guinea Pig. The reality is that what shocks one person's nervous system might not shock another. You know, that's the subjectivity of horror. So, in theory, this is definitely a gnarly movie. There's no getting around that. It's brutal, it's sick, there's rape, there's themes of revenge. And if that's what you care about, this might actually be worth watching for you. And, you know, there are certain parts of the film that are not too bad, especially considering the budget. So, it's pretty gory, it's pretty violent. I think the premise of the film is interesting enough that it justifies the violence in the movie, but it also justifies an even more violent movie. So for me, this is a weird thing where the director forgets the story and forgets the focus at certain points and then goes in the direction of exploitation. But for some reason, I have this feeling that he couldn't choose. Like, are you going to focus on story or are you going to focus on grotesque, disgusting, detailed, extreme stuff? And this was kind of like a weirdly kind of 50-50. You're getting half of each. And the result of it is a script that is just full of flaws and has some kind of weak hooks and some things that happen that are just exceedingly convenient with some very passive, at times passive main characters. There are times where they're not as passive, but their decisions just kind of border on like, what are you doing? Are you even doing anything? Does this story actually make sense? Makeup effects, practical effects, and some of the cinematography is good for a low-budget movie, but the actual quality of the film is not really there for me. The actual disturbedness of the experience is also not really there for me. So I think it's a decent attempt. I think it's respectable. Clearly somebody tried to do something extraordinary. The result itself, it's missing something for me, but it could be worth a watch. I mean, when you think about it and you kind of summarize the stuff that actually happens, you have the opening sequence, which is pretty crazy. You have the dual rape sequence, which is pretty crazy. You have the baby fisting or whatever that was. You also have actually one of the modern day sequences of the bad guy's son blowing his dad, which kind of adds to the weirdness of the film. There's definitely some stuff there, but somehow not very tough, and just too long for me. I guess I just wanted more filth, but maybe that's just me. There is actually a point where one of the four girls kind of escapes, but instead of going and getting help for the rest of her friends and help for the whole situation, who are still captive, by the way, at the time, she kind of spends time standing in front of a mirror and contemplating suicide until the killer actually shoots her in the head from behind. And you can argue that a traumatized person in that situation is not super resourceful, and maybe it's not an unrealistic sequence, but again, it just kind of adds to that feeling of like, why are the people, the good characters in the film, why are they so incompetent somehow, you know? I guess the plot is just too contrived for me at the end of the day. The writing just isn't strong enough. It just surprises me, you know? It surprises me that the film never commits to being a truly deranged torture porn flick. And when that's not what you're doing, I think your story needs to deliver. It doesn't hit that thing that makes you go, ooh, I'm uncomfortable now. Or, I mean, it does at points, but it lasts for like a couple of minutes and then it's over. It doesn't stick with me. But like I said, I have seen other reactions where people watch this film and it really sticks with them. So, I don't know.